Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I've driven closed roads at night for 8 years. Flooded shoulders, fire-damaged surfaces, sections undermined by washout that look solid until they aren't. I've done post-incident assessments on roads where the incident was a fatality and the blood was still on the asphalt because nobody cleans that up before the safety evaluator arrives. I've worked through all of it with the same methodical approach because methodical is what the job requires, and I'm good at the job. I want to establish that before anything else. I want to be clear about who I am professionally, because what I'm about to describe is going to sound like the account of someone who isn't, and I need you to have the baseline before I get into what happened on Route 7 spur. The road had been closed for 6 weeks when I got the assignment. 11 drivers over that period had filed incident reports through the state hotline. Not accident reports, incident reports, which is the category for events where a driver perceives a hazard and nothing collides. The hotline gets a lot of noise. People report shadows and deer and their own high beams reflecting off-road signs. The threshold for a road closure on the basis of incident reports is high enough that 11 in 6 weeks on a single half-mile stretch was worth flagging. I pulled the reports before I drove out. That's standard procedure. You want to know what you're assessing before you're in the middle of assessing it. The reports were consistent. Not approximately consistent, not consistent in the way that people describing the same deer from different angles are consistent. Consistent in the specific way that made the flagging supervisor send them up the chain rather than filing them as wildlife interference and clearing the road. Every driver had reported the same thing. Something crossing the road in front of their vehicle on the half-mile stretch between the 2 culvert crossings, crossing from the west ditch to the east ditch, moving fast. The descriptions of the thing itself varied in the ways that eyewitness descriptions always vary. Height estimates ranged. The language used was different from report to report, but the structural details were the same across all 11. The way it moved, the shape of it, the specific wrongness of the lower limbs. One report used the phrase like a person who learned to walk from a description. I wrote that down on my notepad and looked at it for a moment, and then I drove out. Route 7 spur was a 2-lane connector road between a state highway and a county agricultural route, functional primarily for farm equipment access and not heavily trafficked even when open. The closure had rerouted the light civilian traffic that used it onto a longer county road to the north, which added 12 minutes to the commute for approximately 40 households and had not generated significant complaint. The road was closed, people were going around it, and the state wanted to know if it could be reopened. I signed out a DOT assessment truck, heavy gauge, good headlights, the roll cage and reinforced doors that made it the standard vehicle for night road work, and drove out at 10 in the evening. The closed stretch was about 40 minutes from the district depot, and I arrived at the western closure barrier just before 11. I got out and moved the barrier aside and drove through and replaced it behind me and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running, looking at the road ahead, It was a normal road. 2 lanes, painted center line faded but present, the shoulder dropping into drainage ditches on both sides that were deep enough to do their job in a heavy rain. The headlights carried a good distance ahead. I could see the road running straight for approximately a quarter mile before a slight curve took it out of sight. I noted the time and drove forward. The first culvert crossing was at the 3rd tenth of a mile, a standard corrugated steel pipe running under the road to connect the east and west drainage ditches. I slowed and got out and checked it with my flashlight. Clear, no obstruction, running clean. I noted it and got back in and continued. Between the first and second culvert crossings was the half mile the 11 reports had flagged. I drove it at assessment speed, which is 15 miles an hour, with my high beams on and my full attention on the road surface and the ditches on both sides. The surface was in good condition. No cracking, no heaving, no evidence of undermining. The ditches were clear. The shoulders were intact. I was 3/10 of a mile into the flagged stretch, about halfway through it, when my headlights caught something in the road. I stopped. I want to describe it carefully, because careful is the only way I know how to describe something, and because I wrote down everything I could remember immediately afterward, while I was still on the road, before I drove to the depot, and before I talked to anyone. And I want the description to be what I saw rather than what the subsequent hours of processing it did to what I saw. It was in the road, not at the edge of the road, not partially in the ditch, in the road, in my lane, caught fully in the headlights at a distance of approximately 60 feet. The height was wrong immediately. Not dramatically wrong, not twice the height of a person, but wrong in the incremental way that makes something look off before you can name what's off. 6.5 feet, maybe approaching 7, with proportions that my brain spent the first 2 seconds trying to organize into something familiar before giving up on the attempt. The torso was too long. The length of it from the base of the neck to where the hips should have been was longer than the legs justified, producing a top-heavy quality that didn't match the way it was standing. The arms were long and hung in a way that arms hang when they aren't being actively used, and there was something wrong with the elbows. They weren't where elbows should be. The joints of the lower arms bent the wrong direction. I don't mean they were backwards exactly. I mean the angle of the bend was inverted in a way that made the lower arms splay slightly outward at rest rather than in. The hands, if they were hands, were down at the level of the knee. The legs. I looked at the legs because the reports had mentioned the legs, and the reports had been right to mention them. There was an extra articulation in each leg at the midpoint of the lower limb, a second joint below the knee that went the wrong direction. When it stood still, the leg had a curve to it below the knee, bowing forward slightly that no human leg has. It was standing on what I assumed were feet, but they were at the end of that forward bow, and I couldn't see them clearly. The head was low between the shoulders, not on a short neck. The neck was there, but the head sat down into it in a way that made the shoulders appear to rise on either side of it. The face was towards me. I couldn't see it clearly at 60 feet with the headlights in its direction, but I could see that it was oriented toward me, and I could see that there were features in approximately the right vertical order. Something where the eyes should be, something where the mouth should be, but the spacing was wrong. too much distance between them, as though whoever had arranged the components had known what a face required, but had overestimated the space the pieces needed. It stood in my headlights for what I estimate was 4 seconds. Then it moved. Fast is the wrong word, and it's the word every one of the 11 reports used because it's the closest available word. What it did was not fast in the way that something fast moves. It was fast in the way that a film skips a frame, present in one position and then present in another, with the intervening motion compressed into something the eye could register, but the brain couldn't fully process. It crossed the remaining lane and went off the east side of the road and into the ditch, and I heard it hit the water in the ditch, and I heard the sound of movement in the culvert vegetation, and then the sound stopped. I was sitting in the truck with both hands on the wheel and the engine running and the headlights illuminating an empty road. I should have driven forward. That is the correct decision in that situation. Vehicle is functional. Road ahead is clear. Drive forward and exit the flagged stretch and report what you've seen. I've reviewed that decision many times in the weeks since, and I know it was the correct decision, and I know I didn't make it, and I know why I didn't make it, which is that I was not capable of making any decision for approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds is a long time to sit still in a truck on a closed road at 11 at night. The sound from the east ditch started before the 90 seconds were up. Not a dramatic sound, not a roar, not anything that belonged in a horror film. A sound like something large moving through shallow water and wet vegetation, which is exactly what it was, because that is what the drainage ditch contained, and something was moving through it. Moving towards the truck, I heard it come up along the passenger side of the road, below the shoulder grade, below the window line, moving parallel to the truck, moving in the direction of the cab. I want to be honest about what I did at this point, which is that I put my hand on the gear selector and I did not shift it. My foot was on the brake and I did not release the brake. I am a person who has been doing this job for 8 years, and I pride myself on the capacity to act under conditions that would freeze someone with less field experience. And I sat in a running truck in gear with my foot on the brake, and I did not move. The sound stopped alongside the cab. Then the weight hit the passenger door. Not a strike, not something hitting the door with force. Weight. The weight of something pressing against the exterior of the door, the way a large dog presses against a door when it wants to come in, distributed and deliberate. The door held. The DOT assessment truck has reinforced doors, as I mentioned, and the door held, but the pressure against it was enough to flex the interior panel, and I could feel it through the frame of the vehicle. I looked at the passenger window. The window was above the ditch line. The shoulder of the road put the base of the door about 2 feet above the ditch floor. Whatever was pressing against the door from the ditch side was reaching up to do it, and the part of it that was visible above the window line was the top of the head and the upper portion of the face. I could see the eyes clearly at this range. I'm going to describe them because I wrote them down immediately afterward, and the description has not changed in the weeks since. The eyes were large, too large for the face. They had the quality of eyes that reflect light rather than absorb it. Pale, almost luminous in the ambient glow from the instrument panel, without the dark pupil contrast that human eyes have at close range. They were looking directly at me, not moving, not scanning the cab, fixed on me with the specific attention of something that has identified the object of its interest and is not yet done with the identification. The face below them, what I could see of it above the window line, confirmed what I'd seen at 60 feet. The spacing was wrong. There was too much face between the eyes and the mouth. The skin, if it was skin, had the texture and color of something that spent its time in wet drainage infrastructure. Pale, slightly slick in appearance, with a grayish cast that I've spent a lot of time since trying to attribute to the lighting, and I'm not convinced I can. It looked at me for a long time, then it dropped back into the ditch, and I heard it move away from the truck, back towards the culvert crossing, and I heard the sound of it going into the culvert, and then there was no sound. I released the brake. I drove the remaining distance of the flagged stretch at a speed that I did not note in my log because the speed was not appropriate for a safety assessment vehicle on a road evaluation. I cleared the second culvert crossing and reached the eastern closure barrier and got out and moved it and drove through and stopped on the far side of the closed section and sat with the engine running for a while. I took out my notepad and I wrote down everything I've just described in the same order, as completely as I could while the truck was still warm and my hands were only approximately steady. I wrote down the height estimate and the limb articulation and the face and the eyes. I wrote down the sound it made in the ditch and the weight against the door. I wrote down the duration of the visual contact through the window, which I estimated at between 15 and 20 seconds. Then I drove back to the depot. My supervisor was not on shift when I returned. I filed my assessment report in the system, and I flagged it for his attention, and I went home. He called me the following morning and asked if I could come in. I went in. We sat in his office and he read the report while I was there, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at me for a moment. He asked if I stood by the report as filed. I said I did. He said he was going to send it up the chain and that in the meantime the road would remain closed. He asked if I wanted to add anything to the filed document or modify any of the language. I said no. He nodded once, the way my supervisor nodded when he'd made a decision and had moved past the point of discussing it. He asked how I was doing. I said I was fine. That was approximately true in a way that covered the professional requirements. He said he'd be in touch when there was a decision from the chain, and he thanked me for the assessment. I drove back to the depot and signed in my vehicle and went home. The road was closed permanently 4 weeks later. Not temporarily closed pending further assessment. Not closed with a review date attached. Permanently. The official notation in the State Road Database listed the closure basis as safety assessment findings, which is an administrative category I had not seen used for a permanent closure before. I asked my supervisor about it. He said the assessment findings had been reviewed at the district level and the determination had been made that the road did not meet the threshold for reopening at this time. He used the phrase "at this time," which is the phrase used when a review date will eventually be set. Then he moved on to the next item on his desk. I looked up the Route 7 spur closure in the State Road database that evening. In the notes field, below the standard administrative language, there was a single line that had been added by someone at the district level. It said, "Consistent with prior findings. Reference file 2009 RDCL 114. I requested access to file 2 009 RDCL 114. The file had been archived at the restricted access level, which I did not have clearance for. I thought about that for a while. 2009 was 14 years ago. The road had been assessed before, and the findings had been consistent enough with what I'd found that someone at the district level knew to reference them without asking for clarification, which meant that in 2009, or at some point before the file was created, someone else had driven that stretch and written something down, and what they'd written was not inconsistent with a person sitting in a reinforced DOT truck while something pressed its weight against the passenger door. I didn't pursue the file access request. I thought about pursuing it, and I decided against it, which is one of the few decisions I've made in this whole situation that I'm completely at peace with. I still do night assessments. The job is the job, and I'm good at it, and the events of one night on one closed road are not sufficient reason to stop doing work. I've done competently for 8 years. I've been back out 3 times since Route 7, Spur, and all 3 assessments were exactly what assessments usually are: road surfaces, drainage conditions, shoulder integrity, the measured and manageable catalogue of things that can be documented and resolved. But I check the culvert crossings differently now. Not differently in a way I could explain as a formal procedural change, just differently. I stop further back. I leave the engine running. I listen for longer before I get out. I know the drainage systems of these roads differently now. The way they connect east ditch to west ditch through the culvert pipe, running the length of the road under the shoulder. A network, when you think about it. A connected system of infrastructure that runs parallel to every road in the district, wet and dark and undisturbed by the traffic moving above it. I know what can move through a connected system like that if it's learned the route. I drive home from night assessments on the main highways now, not the back connectors, not the county roads that cut 10 minutes off the drive, but pass culvert after culvert in the dark. The drainage ditches running alongside the main highways have more lights. I prefer more lights.